Moscow, 1952. In a secure conference room deep within KGB headquarters on Dzerzhinsky Square, Colonel Yuri Korovin studied a photograph of a young British civil servant with careful attention. The photograph showed an unremarkable man in his late 20s, slightly built, with soft features and an immaculate suit that seemed expensive for a junior clerk. Korovin had seen hundreds of such photographs over his career, potential assets identified by Soviet intelligence across Western capitals. But this one was different. This one carried a notation in red ink: vulnerable, high access potential, recommend active cultivation. Korovin turned to his deputy and spoke with the confidence of a man who had studied human weakness for 2 decades. The British believe their civil service is incorruptible. They trust in class loyalty, in the old-school tie, in centuries of tradition. They have built an empire on the assumption that Englishmen of proper breeding will naturally protect English secrets. He tapped the photograph. They are about to learn that loneliness is a more powerful force than loyalty. This man, this John Vassall, he lives in a country that has made his very existence illegal. Britain criminalizes who he is. We will offer him what his own country denies: acceptance, and in exchange he will give us the Royal Navy. The KGB had been studying British security vulnerabilities since the end of World War II. They had identified a critical flaw in the British system. The Official Secrets Act of 1911 made the unauthorized disclosure of government information a criminal offense. But British law also criminalized homosexuality under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. Any man caught in a homosexual act faced up to 2 years of imprisonment with hard labor. This created a perfect trap. A homosexual man working in government faced two impossible choices: live in complete secrecy, denying his nature and risking exposure, or leave government service entirely. The KGB understood that this legal framework created thousands of potential assets, men living double lives, terrified of exposure, desperate for acceptance. Korovin had run operations across Western Europe for 15 years. He had recruited ideological communists, mercenary agents motivated by money, and blackmail victims forced into cooperation through threats. But he had learned that the most productive assets were those motivated by a hunger for acceptance. Ideology could waver. Money could be matched by counteroffers. But the need to be seen, to be accepted, to be valued for who you truly are, that need was unshakable. John Vassall was about to be posted to the British Embassy in Moscow. The KGB had 18 months to transform a lonely clerk into a productive intelligence asset. Korovin was confident they would succeed. What the KGB couldn't predict was the scale of their success. Over the next decade, John Vassall would betray more than 10,000 classified documents, compromising British naval capabilities, NATO coordination, submarine deployments, and radar systems. He would provide the Soviet Union with detailed intelligence on Western naval strategy that would shape Soviet military planning for years. And he would do all of this while living openly beyond his means in central London, attending parties, driving expensive cars, wearing tailored Italian suits, and somehow avoiding suspicion from the very security services that were supposed to protect British secrets. The British miscalculation wasn't just about one man. It was about an entire system that created the vulnerabilities it claimed to prevent. London, 1952. The city was trapped between 2 centuries, between the imperial past it couldn't quite release and the diminished future it couldn't quite accept. 7 years after victory in World War II, the physical scars of the Blitz were still visible. Bombed-out buildings stood like broken teeth between new construction. Rationing had only recently ended. The British Empire was dissolving, colony by colony, yet the machinery of imperial administration continued as though nothing had changed. In the middle of this fading grandeur stood the old Admiralty building on Whitehall, headquarters of the Royal Navy, repository of centuries of naval tradition and decades of classified secrets. John William Vassall arrived for work each morning at precisely 8:45 a.m. He was 28 years old, a junior clerk in the Naval Intelligence Division. To his colleagues, he was harmless, quiet, and unfailingly polite. He was the man who remembered birthdays, brought cakes to the office, and laughed at jokes that weren't particularly funny. He wore his suits with careful attention, favoring Italian cuts with faint pinstripes, the kind of clothing that seemed slightly beyond what a junior civil servant's salary could comfortably afford. He kept fresh flowers on his desk. He spoke softly and deferentially to his superiors. He seemed, in every way, safe. But John Vassall was living a lie that was slowly consuming him from within. In 1952 Britain, homosexuality was not just socially unacceptable. It was a criminal offense. The police actively hunted homosexual men, using agents provocateurs and surveillance to identify and prosecute them. Between 1945 and 1955, more than 5,000 men were imprisoned for homosexual offenses. Thousands more were chemically castrated, subjected to aversion therapy, or driven to suicide by the exposure of their private lives. The brilliant mathematician Alan Turing, who had helped break German codes during World War II, was convicted of gross indecency in 1952 and forced to undergo chemical castration. He died by suicide 2 years later. Vassall had learned to hide his nature behind a performance of normalcy. He attended church. He smiled at the right moments. He expressed interest when colleagues discussed their wives and children. But the loneliness was crushing. He lived in small rented rooms, listening to classical music alone, reading novels about places he would never visit. He had occasional encounters in the shadows, furtive meetings in public restrooms or dark corners of parks, always terrified of discovery, always aware that one wrong move could end his career and send him to prison. The constant fear had become so familiar that he barely noticed it anymore. It was simply the background condition of his existence. In the spring of 1954, the Admiralty offered Vassall a posting to Moscow. He would serve as a clerk in the British Embassy, supporting the naval attaché. The assignment was considered a plum posting, a sign of trust and a boost to his career. The salary included a foreign service supplement. For Vassall, it represented something more profound. Escape. Escape from the gray drabness of post-war London. Escape from the constant vigilance required to maintain his secret. Escape to somewhere large and anonymous where perhaps, just perhaps, he could breathe more freely. He arrived in Moscow in September 1954. The city was nothing like the propaganda photographs suggested. The cold was brutal, cutting through clothing with physical force. The streets were wide but lifeless, dominated by monumental architecture that seemed designed to make human beings feel small. The British Embassy on Sofiaskaya Embankment was a Victorian building that looked displaced in the Soviet capital, a fragment of London transplanted to the banks of the Moscow River. The embassy corridor smelled of boiled cabbage and institutional anxiety. Everyone assumed the walls had listening devices. Every Russian the British diplomats encountered was assumed to be KGB. But beneath the gray uniformity of official Moscow, there was another city. There were apartments where Western records played on smuggled turntables. There were private gatherings where intellectuals discussed books the state had banned. And for those who knew where to look, there were places where men like John Vassall could find others like themselves. The Soviet Union officially denied that homosexuality existed under socialism, but reality was more complex. The state persecuted homosexual men when it chose to, but it also tolerated them when they were useful. The KGB understood what British intelligence apparently did not. That secrecy created leverage. It began at a diplomatic reception in November 1954. Vassall, uncomfortable in his formal attire, stood near the buffet table, holding a glass of wine he wasn't drinking and trying to appear engaged with a conversation he wasn't following. A tall man approached him, smiling with easy confidence. He introduced himself as Mikko, a translator with the Soviet Ministry of Culture. His English was perfect, barely accented. They talked about music, about London theater, about the difficulty of adjusting to Moscow winters. Mikhail was charming, interested, and remarkably well-informed about British culture. Before the evening ended, he suggested they continue the conversation over dinner. Vassall, starved for genuine connection, agreed without hesitation. What Vassall didn't know was that Mikhail was not a translator. He was Captain Mikhail Pavlovich, a KGB officer assigned to the Second Chief Directorate, responsible for counterintelligence and the surveillance of foreign diplomats. Pavlovich had been studying Vassall since his arrival in Moscow. The KGB maintained extensive files on every Western diplomat posted to the Soviet Union. They knew Vassall's salary, his housing situation, his daily routines, and most importantly, his psychological profile. The assessment was clear: lonely, insecure, susceptible to flattery, and living a secret that could be exploited. Over the following weeks, Pavlovich cultivated the relationship with professional skill. He introduced Vassall to a circle of friends, educated Muscovites who spoke multiple languages and seemed sophisticated beyond anything Vassall had encountered in London. They met in private apartments, away from official scrutiny. They discussed art, literature, and music. They drank French wine and listened to American jazz. And gradually, carefully, Pavlovich introduced Vassall to other men, men who shared his inclinations, men who made him feel, for the first time in his life, that he wasn't alone. The trap was laid with exquisite care. In January 1955, Pavlovich invited Vassall to a party at a private apartment in central Moscow. The apartment was elegant, decorated with velvet drapes and soft lighting that made everything look warm and inviting. There were perhaps a dozen people there, all men, all friendly and welcoming. The alcohol flowed freely. The music was Western, the kind of music that was officially frowned upon but somehow available to those with the right connections. Vassall, intoxicated by acceptance and alcohol in equal measure, allowed himself to believe he had found a place where he could be himself. The apartment, of course, was a KGB facility. The cameras were hidden behind decorative molding and mirrors. The lighting had been calculated to provide optimal photographic clarity. Every person at that party was either a KGB officer or a controlled asset. And by the end of the evening, when Vassall was photographed in compromising positions with other men, the trap had closed completely. The photographs arrived 2 days later, slipped under his apartment door in an unmarked envelope. Vassall's hands shook so violently as he opened the envelope that he had to sit down on the floor. Inside were 8 photographs, each one clear and unmistakable. Vassall naked, laughing, entangled with other men. Frozen moments of what had felt like freedom, but was, in reality, a carefully constructed cage. Attached to the photographs was a brief note typed on plain paper. "Comrade Vassall, we believe you will wish to help us in matters of mutual interest. We will contact you with details." That was how it began, not with ideology or political conviction, not with a dramatic recruitment pitch or appeals to class warfare, with humiliation, with the threat of exposure, with the knowledge that if these photographs became public, Vassall would lose everything. His career would end. His family would be destroyed by shame. He would be arrested, tried, imprisoned, and branded a criminal deviant for the rest of his life. The KGB had studied British law and British society and understood exactly what leverage they held. When Pavlovich made contact 3 days later, the conversation was brief and businesslike. There would be no threats, no melodrama. Vassall would provide information from his work at the embassy, documents that crossed his desk, details about personnel and procedures. In exchange, the photographs would remain private. Vassall, trapped and terrified, agreed. He told himself it would be temporary. He told himself the information he provided wouldn't matter. He told himself he had no choice. All of these things were true, and all of them were lies he used to make the unbearable bearable. The KGB understood the psychology of blackmail better than any intelligence service in the world. They knew that the initial agreement was just the beginning. Once Vassall crossed the line, once he provided that first document, he could never go back. Each subsequent betrayal became easier because the consequences of stopping became more severe. If he confessed now, he would face charges not just for his private life but for espionage. The trap tightened with every document he photographed, with every meeting he attended, with every piece of information he provided. Vassall's first act of espionage was small and seemingly insignificant. He photographed a routine administrative memo about embassy personnel rotations. The document contained no classified information. It was exactly the kind of low-value intelligence that made new assets feel safe. But it established the pattern. It demonstrated that Vassall could access documents, photograph them undetected, and deliver the film to his handlers. The KGB didn't need dramatic secrets immediately. They needed proof of concept. They needed to know that their asset could function. Over the following months, the requests escalated gradually. A document about naval attaché travel schedules, a memo discussing British assessment of Soviet naval capabilities, a technical report on radar systems. Each request was carefully calibrated to be just slightly more sensitive than the last, pushing Vassall deeper into betrayal, while never pushing so far that he would panic and confess. The KGB had refined this technique over decades. They understood that effective asset management required patience and psychological manipulation more than coercion. In December 1955, after 15 months in Moscow, Vassall returned to London. His posting had ended, and he was reassigned to the Naval Intelligence Division at the Admiralty. He should have felt relief. He was returning home, returning to the relative safety of London, escaping the immediate control of the KGB. But he felt only dread, because the KGB had made clear that the arrangement would continue. They had established contact procedures for London, dead drops in public parks, signals using chalk marks on lampposts, coded messages in classified advertisements. The espionage would continue, but now it would happen in the heart of British military intelligence. What Vassall didn't know was that the KGB considered him one of their most promising assets. His access in London would be far greater than anything he could provide from Moscow. The Naval Intelligence Division handled classified material ranging from technical specifications of British submarines to NATO coordination documents to assessments of Soviet naval capabilities. Vassall's new position gave him routine access to documents that Moscow desperately wanted. The KGB assessment of their asset was clear: high value, low risk, excellent potential for long-term exploitation. Back in London, Vassall resumed his life as a civil servant. But now, with KGB money supplementing his salary, he could afford luxuries he had only dreamed about before. He moved to a comfortable flat in Dolphin Square, an expensive residential complex in Pimlico. He bought a car, a sporty model that turned heads. He wore bespoke suits from Savile Row tailors. He attended theater and opera. He dined at expensive restaurants. He lived in every visible way beyond his means. And somehow, incredibly, nobody seemed to notice or care. This was the British security establishment's fundamental miscalculation. They had extensive procedures for vetting personnel, conducting security reviews, and monitoring for signs of espionage. But those procedures were built on assumptions about what a spy looked like. A spy would be secretive, withdrawn, nervous. A spy would avoid attention and live modestly to avoid suspicion. John Vassall did the opposite. He flaunted his wealth. He drew attention to himself through his clothing and lifestyle. And because his behavior didn't match the expected profile, security services never seriously investigated him. The psychology of this blindness is revealing. British intelligence had been traumatized by the defection of Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean in 1951. Both men had been respected diplomats who fled to Moscow after years of espionage. The scandal had exposed serious security failures and led to extensive reforms, but those reforms focused on ideological vetting, on identifying communist sympathizers within government. The security establishment was looking for ideological traitors. They weren't looking for lonely men exploited through blackmail. They weren't looking for someone who wore his secret in plain sight through expensive suits and theatrical displays of wealth. Vassall's handler in London was a KGB officer named Yuri Nikolaevich. They met in cafes, in parks, and once, memorably, in the hushed aisles of a Kensington department store, pretending to browse silk ties while passing a microfilm cylinder disguised inside a gift box. Nikolaevich was always impeccably dressed, always calm, always ready with flattery wrapped in ideology. "Your country plays dangerous games with nuclear weapons and naval expansion," he would say. "But you, John, you are one of the wise ones. You are helping to prevent war. You are helping to maintain the balance that keeps the peace." Vassall absorbed this rhetoric desperately because it gave meaning to his betrayal. He wasn't a traitor. He was a peacemaker. He wasn't stealing secrets. He was preventing catastrophe through the careful sharing of information that helped both sides understand each other. The KGB understood that effective asset management required giving operatives a narrative they could believe, a story that transformed shame into purpose. Vassall needed to believe he was doing something noble, even as he photographed documents that compromised British military capabilities. The work became routine. Vassall had access to a constant flow of classified documents as part of his duties: naval intelligence assessments, technical specifications for radar and sonar systems, reports on submarine deployments and NATO exercises, documents detailing British assessment of Soviet naval capabilities. He developed a system. He would identify valuable documents during the workday, noting which ones contained information Moscow would find useful. Then, after hours when the office was quiet, he would return to his desk with a Minox camera concealed in his briefcase. The Minox was a German-made miniature camera, small enough to fit in a closed hand, capable of photographing documents with remarkable clarity. The photography required careful technique. Vassall had to position the document on his desk, ensure adequate lighting, hold the camera steady, and photograph each page without creating suspicious noise. A multi-page document might require 20 or 30 photographs. The work was tedious and nerve-wracking. Every sound in the corridor made his heart race. Every footstep suggested discovery. But over months and years, the fear became familiar, and the familiar became routine. He photographed documents 2 or 3 times per week, sometimes more during periods of intense activity. The microfilm was passed to his handler using classic espionage tradecraft: dead drops in hollow trees in Kensington Gardens, chalk signals on lampposts indicating when material was ready for collection, brief brush passes in crowded areas where the exchange happened so quickly that observers wouldn't notice. The KGB had refined these techniques over decades of operations in hostile territory. The methods worked because they exploited human psychology. People don't notice what they don't expect to see: a man tying his shoe near a tree, a woman adjusting her purse in a crowd. These actions are so ordinary that they become invisible. Between 1956 and 1962, John Vassall betrayed approximately 10,000 classified documents. The precise number is difficult to establish because many documents were never recovered, and Vassall's own memory of what he had photographed was incomplete. But the assessment from both British intelligence and KGB records suggests that the volume was staggering. Among the compromised materials were technical specifications for the British Navy's new radar systems, detailed intelligence on NATO naval coordination procedures, assessments of Soviet submarine capabilities, and documents detailing British cryptographic procedures for naval communications. The intelligence value was immense. Soviet naval planners gained detailed understanding of British capabilities and intentions. They learned which technologies the British considered most advanced. They understood how NATO navies coordinated operations. They gained insight into British assessment of Soviet strengths and weaknesses, which told them where their own security was failing and where British intelligence had blind spots. This wasn't the spectacular coup of stealing war plans or nuclear secrets. It was something more valuable, comprehensive, detailed, sustained intelligence that shaped Soviet military planning across years. And through it all, Vassall continued to live his double life. By day, he was the helpful clerk, the man who typed reports and filed documents and brought tea to senior officers. By night, he was the man who attended parties in expensive clothing, who drove his sports car through London streets, who lived in a flat that cost more than his salary could justify. The contradiction was obvious to anyone who looked. The tragedy was that nobody looked closely enough. The strain was beginning to show. Vassall kept a diary, entries written in careful, controlled handwriting. Between the polite descriptions of daily events were hints of the psychological pressure. "Another difficult day at the office," he wrote in March 1960. "I felt as though everyone was watching me, though I know this is foolish." In another entry, "The weight of maintaining appearances grows heavier. I wonder how long one can continue before something breaks." What Vassall couldn't know was that British security services were beginning to notice patterns, not about him specifically, but about information that was appearing in Soviet intelligence assessments. Documents that the Soviets shouldn't have access to were informing their naval strategy. The leak was real, but identifying the source was proving impossible. The security establishment conducted reviews, interviewed personnel, and tightened procedures, but they continued to look in the wrong places. They suspected ideological traitors, communist sympathizers who had infiltrated government. They weren't looking for a lonely clerk who had been blackmailed in Moscow 7 years earlier. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In 1961, a Soviet intelligence officer named Anatoly Golitsyn defected to the West. Golitsyn brought with him fragmentary information about KGB operations in Britain. He didn't know Vassall's name, but he described a British naval clerk who had been recruited in Moscow through blackmail and was providing high-value intelligence from London. The description was vague but specific enough to narrow the field of suspects significantly. British counterintelligence began reviewing personnel who had served in Moscow and now worked in naval intelligence. Vassall was on that list, but he wasn't the only one. The investigation proceeded slowly and carefully. Security services couldn't simply arrest everyone who had worked in Moscow. They needed evidence. They began discreet surveillance of the suspects, monitoring their movements, their finances, their contacts. For Vassall, who had been operating without detection for 7 years, the net was finally beginning to close. In March 1962, MI5 officers noticed something unusual. Vassall made regular visits to certain locations in London parks, always alone, always at odd times. He would walk to a specific tree, pause near it for a moment, then continue. The behavior was consistent with dead drop procedures. Surveillance was intensified. On April 12, 1962, officers observed Vassall approach a hollow tree in Kensington Gardens, reach into a cavity in the trunk, and deposit something inside. 20 minutes later, a man approached the same tree, retrieved the item, and walked away. The man was followed to the Soviet embassy. The evidence was now compelling, but MI5 needed more than surveillance observations. They needed proof that would hold up in court. They obtained a warrant to search Vassall's flat in Dolphin Square. On September 12, 1962, while Vassall was at work, investigators entered his home. What they found was staggering: a Minox camera, photographic equipment, unexplained cash totaling more than £3,000, documents that appeared to be coded instructions, and hidden in a compartment behind a false panel in his wardrobe, microfilm of classified documents waiting to be passed to his handler. The arrest came the next morning. September 13th, 1962, at 8:30 a.m. Vassall arrived at the Admiralty as usual, carrying his briefcase and wearing one of his expensive suits. Two men in plain clothes approached him in the lobby. "Mr. Vassall, we're with M. Ifiv. Would you please come with us?" His legs nearly gave out. For 7 years he had lived in terror of this moment. Now that it had arrived, he felt almost relieved. The performance could finally stop. They took him to an interrogation room in M. Ifiv headquarters. The room was small, windowless, and deliberately uncomfortable. A tall man entered and introduced himself as Inspector Ferguson. "Mr. Vassall," he said quietly, "we found some interesting items in your flat yesterday. I think you know what we need to discuss." Vassall said nothing. Ferguson slid a folder across the table. Inside were photographs of the items seized from his apartment. The camera, the cash, the microfilm. "You've been photographing documents from the Admiralty," Ferguson said. "It wasn't a question. You've been passing those photographs to Soviet intelligence. We have surveillance evidence placing you at multiple dead drop locations. We have testimony from a Soviet defector describing your recruitment in Moscow. The evidence is comprehensive. You can make this easier on yourself by cooperating." The interrogation lasted 11 hours. Vassall initially denied everything, maintaining that the items in his flat had been planted, that he was being framed. But as the evidence accumulated, as they showed him surveillance photographs and detailed logs of his movements, his resistance crumbled. By evening, he was ready to confess. Not because he wanted to, but because continuing to deny the obvious had become exhausting. "It started in Moscow," he said quietly. "They took photographs, compromising photographs. They said I had to help them or the photographs would be sent to my employers, to my family. I didn't want to. I never wanted to. But I couldn't let those photographs become public. Do you understand what would happen to me?" Ferguson understood, but understanding didn't change the law. "How many documents did you photograph?" he asked. Vassall shook his head. "I don't know, hundreds, perhaps thousands. Over 6 years I provided whatever they requested. Naval intelligence, technical specifications, NATO documents. I don't know precisely what Moscow found valuable. I just photographed what they asked for and hoped it wouldn't matter." The confession continued over several days. Vassall provided details about his recruitment, his handlers, his dead drop locations, and his communication procedures. He described the psychological pressure, the constant fear, the sense of being trapped in a situation with no escape. He also described how easy it had been. "Nobody ever questioned my lifestyle," he said. "I lived openly beyond my means. I drove an expensive car. I wore suits that cost more than a month's salary, and nobody seemed to care. It was as though they didn't want to ask questions because they were afraid of what they might discover." This observation would prove to be one of the most damaging aspects of the entire case. Vassall had been living in open contradiction to his official salary for 6 years. His colleagues had joked about his expensive taste. Some had wondered aloud how he afforded his lifestyle. But nobody had reported their concerns to security services. The British establishment's culture of discretion, of not prying into personal affairs, had created a protective shield around Vassall. The very politeness that was supposed to define British civil society had become a security vulnerability. The trial began on October 22, 1962, at the Old Bailey. Public interest was intense. The press called Vassall the Playboy spy, emphasizing his expensive lifestyle and suggesting, without quite stating, that his homosexuality was connected to his treachery. The proceedings were conducted partly in closed session to protect classified information, but enough details emerged to create a national scandal. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence. The camera, the microfilm, the surveillance observations, and Vassall's own confession. The defense had little to work with except to argue for leniency based on the coercion Vassall had faced. The most dramatic moment came when the prosecution presented evidence of the scale of betrayal. Over a period of 6 years, the prosecutor stated, the defendant photographed approximately 10,000 classified documents. These documents provided the Soviet Union with comprehensive intelligence on British naval capabilities, NATO coordination procedures, and technological developments. The damage to British security cannot be precisely calculated, but it is severe and lasting. Vassall sat in the dock, appearing small and defeated. When asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, he stood and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. I never wanted to betray my country. I was trapped by circumstances I couldn't control. I know that doesn't excuse what I did. I know the damage I've caused. I can only say that I am sorry, though I know that sorry cannot repair the harm. The judge was unmoved. On October 29, 1962, he sentenced John Vassall to 18 years imprisonment. You betrayed your country for money and to conceal your illegal activities, the judge said. You placed British lives at risk and compromised national security over a period of years. The sentence must reflect the severity of your crimes. But the Vassall case didn't end with his imprisonment. Within days, the scandal expanded beyond one man's betrayal to questions about systemic failure. How had Vassall operated undetected for 6 years? Why had nobody questioned his lifestyle? Who was responsible for the security failures that allowed this to happen? The press began investigating, and what they discovered was deeply embarrassing to the government. It emerged that multiple people had noticed Vassall's expensive lifestyle and made informal comments about it, but nobody had filed formal reports with security services. The culture of discretion had prevented action. It also emerged that Vassall had socialized with several politicians and senior civil servants, attending parties and dinners where he had been seen driving expensive cars and wearing expensive clothes. The question became impossible to ignore. Had anyone in positions of authority been willfully blind to Vassall's activities? Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, already damaged by other scandals, moved to contain the political damage. He established the Radcliffe Tribunal, a judicial inquiry tasked with investigating the security failures surrounding the Vassall case. The tribunal heard testimony from dozens of witnesses, including Vassall himself, who was brought from prison to give evidence. The proceedings revealed a portrait of an intelligence establishment that had been unprepared for the kind of threat Vassall represented. The tribunal's report, published in April 1963, was devastating in its conclusions. It found that security procedures had been inadequate, that warning signs had been ignored, and that the culture of discretion within the civil service had prevented appropriate action. But the report also identified the fundamental vulnerability that the KGB had exploited. British law criminalized homosexuality, creating a class of people who lived in constant fear of exposure and were therefore vulnerable to blackmail. The report stopped short of recommending decriminalization, but it made clear that the current legal framework created security risks. The political fallout was significant. Thomas Galbraith, a junior minister at the Admiralty who had socialized with Vassall, was forced to resign despite denying any knowledge of espionage. 2 journalists were imprisoned for refusing to reveal their sources in articles about the case. The government's handling of the scandal became increasingly heavy-handed, which only fueled public criticism. By the summer of 1963, the Vassall affair had contributed to a general sense that the Macmillan government was incompetent and out of touch. In Moscow, KGB analysts studied the case with clinical interest. Internal reports praised the operational success while analyzing the failure points. One assessment noted, Asset Vassall provided exceptional intelligence value over 6 years. His compromise resulted from defector information rather than operational errors. The case demonstrates the continued viability of blackmail-based recruitment against targets living under repressive legal frameworks. Recommendation: continue to identify and cultivate vulnerable individuals in Western governments, particularly those subject to legal persecution for their private lives. The cynicism of this assessment reveals the KGB's fundamental approach. They didn't see Vassall as a human being destroyed by circumstance. They saw him as a successful operation that had run its course. The fact that they had exploited a man's fear and loneliness to force him into betraying his country was, from their perspective, simply effective intelligence work. The moral dimension was irrelevant. All that mattered was the intelligence value extracted. For Vassall, prison became a strange refuge. In Wormhood Scrubs and later in other facilities, he was removed from the constant performance that had defined his life. He didn't have to pretend to be someone he wasn't. He didn't have to maintain the fiction of normalcy. The shame of exposure was complete, which meant he had nothing left to protect. He described this paradox in letters. "I am freer in prison than I ever was outside. Here, everyone knows who I am and what I did. There are no more secrets to maintain." He was allowed books, writing materials, and occasional visitors, though few came. His family, devastated by the scandal, maintained minimal contact. His mother wrote occasionally, letters filled with pain and incomprehension. "How could you do this to us?" she asked in one letter. "We raised you to be honest and loyal. How did we fail so completely?" Vassall never responded to that question. How could he explain that his betrayal wasn't about how he was raised, but about a legal and social system that made his existence itself a crime? Over the years in prison, Vassall became something of a curiosity. Other prisoners generally avoided him, viewing him as a traitor. Guards treated him with professional distance, but he developed a routine. He worked in the prison library. He read extensively, particularly history and biography. He wrote, filling notebooks with reflections on his life and the choices he had made. Some of these writings would later be published, providing rare insight into the psychology of espionage and betrayal. In one passage, he wrote, "People want to believe that spies are ideological warriors, heroes or villains motivated by grand political visions. The truth is more banal and more human. I betrayed my country because I was terrified of exposure. I continued betraying my country because stopping seemed more dangerous than continuing. I lived in a kind of fog where each day's betrayal made the next day's betrayal easier, until I could no longer remember who I had been before it all started." Vassall served 10 years of his 18-year sentence, released in October 1972 for good behavior. He was 50 years old, emerging into a world that had changed dramatically during his imprisonment. The Britain of 1972 was very different from the Britain of 1962. The Sexual Offences Act of 1967 had partially decriminalized homosexuality for men over 21 in private. The Cultural Revolution of the 1960s had challenged many traditional assumptions. The empire had continued its dissolution. Even the old Admiralty building where Vassall had worked had been reorganized and its functions dispersed. He found work with a small British company, doing clerical tasks that required no security clearance. He lived quietly in a modest flat, avoiding attention, using his middle name to reduce the chances of recognition. He attended church regularly, finding in religious practice a structure that prison had provided. He remained largely alone, afraid to form deep connections, aware that his past would always be discoverable. In 1975, Vassall published his memoir, Vassall, the autobiography of a spy. The book was controversial, with critics arguing that he was profiting from his crimes. But the memoir provided valuable insight into the mechanics of espionage and the psychology of betrayal. He described the blackmail, the fear, the rationalization, and the slow erosion of moral boundaries. He also offered observations about the security failures that had allowed him to operate undetected. "I was hiding in plain sight," he wrote. "My expensive lifestyle should have triggered investigations. That it didn't reveals how much the establishment preferred comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable truth." The book generated renewed interest in his case, but it didn't change public perception. To most Britons, Vassall remained the Playboy spy. a traitor who had betrayed his country for money and to protect his sexual secrets. The complexity of his situation, the legal persecution that had created his vulnerability, the KGB's sophisticated exploitation of that vulnerability, these nuances were lost in the simpler narrative of betrayal and punishment. Vassall lived another 21 years after publishing his memoir. He died alone in his flat in St. John's Wood, London, on November 18, 1996, at age 71. His death was noted briefly in newspapers, usually with a reminder of his crimes. John Vassall, Cold War spy, dies at 71, read one headline. The obituaries recounted the basic facts: the recruitment in Moscow, the years of espionage, the arrest and conviction, the scandal that followed. Few mentioned the human complexity, the legal framework that had created his vulnerability, or the lessons that might be learned from his story. The legacy of the Vassall case extends far beyond one man's betrayal. It exposed fundamental flaws in British security procedures and contributed to reforms in how intelligence services vetted personnel and monitored for signs of compromise. The case also contributed, albeit slowly and indirectly, to the eventual decriminalization of homosexuality in Britain. The Radcliffe Tribunal's findings made clear that laws criminalizing private sexual behavior created security vulnerabilities by forcing people to live double lives. This argument, though not sufficient by itself to drive legal reform, became part of the broader conversation about the costs of repressive laws. For intelligence professionals, the Vassall case became a textbook study in several lessons. First, that lifestyle incongruities are critical warning signs that must be investigated, not ignored. Second, that security culture must overcome institutional reluctance to ask uncomfortable questions. Third, that laws criminalizing aspects of private life create exploitable vulnerabilities. And fourth, that blackmail-based recruitment, while effective, requires sustained psychological management of the asset, who is operating under constant stress and is vulnerable to eventual breakdown. The KGB learned complementary lessons. They learned that long-term assets could provide sustained intelligence value, but were vulnerable to defector information and to their own psychological deterioration over time. They learned that lifestyle management of assets was as important as operational security, because assets living conspicuously beyond their means would eventually attract attention. And they learned that Western legal frameworks criminalizing homosexuality provided a renewable source of potential assets who could be identified, cultivated, and exploited. The human cost of the Vassall case is difficult to calculate. Beyond the classified documents compromised and the intelligence damage inflicted, there was the destruction of lives. Vassall's own life was defined by fear, shame, and eventual imprisonment. His family was devastated by scandal. His colleagues faced suspicion and investigation. Politicians lost their careers over tenuous connections to him. And somewhere in the machinery of Cold War competition, British sailors and NATO personnel operated with compromised security because their technical capabilities and strategic plans had been exposed to Soviet intelligence. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of the Vassall case is how preventable it was. If British law had not criminalized homosexuality, Vassall would have had no secret to protect and therefore no vulnerability to blackmail. If security culture had encouraged reporting of lifestyle incongruities rather than polite discretion, his expensive living would have triggered investigation years earlier. If the KGB operation in Moscow had been detected and disrupted, the entire chain of events would have been prevented. But none of these interventions occurred, and the result was a decade of sustained espionage that compromised British naval intelligence. The story of John Vassall is ultimately about the intersection of personal vulnerability and geopolitical conflict. He was a lonely man living in a society that criminalized his existence, which made him vulnerable to exploitation, by an intelligence service that specialized in identifying and manipulating human weakness. He made choices that resulted in genuine harm to British security. He betrayed trust and compromised classified information. These facts are undeniable, but he was also a victim of a legal and social system that created the conditions for his exploitation. In the final analysis, the Vassall case reveals a fundamental truth about espionage in the Cold War era. The conflict wasn't just between capitalism and communism, between NATO and the Warsaw Pact, between Washington and Moscow. It was also fought in the intimate spaces of individual lives, exploiting loneliness, fear, shame, and desire. Intelligence services on both sides understood that human vulnerability was the most effective weapon they possessed. They cultivated that vulnerability, exploited it systematically, and discarded the human beings they had used when those assets were no longer valuable. John Vassall spent his adult life as an instrument of that conflict. He was recruited through blackmail, maintained through fear, and eventually discarded when he was exposed. His story is neither heroic nor simple. It's the story of a man who made terrible choices under extraordinary pressure, who betrayed his country to protect a secret that should never have been criminal in the first place, and who spent the remainder of his life living with the consequences of decisions made in moments of terror and desperation. The shadows of that story remain. In intelligence services around the world, the Vassall case is still studied as an example of successful KGB recruitment and sustained asset management. In discussions of security vetting and lifestyle monitoring, his name appears as a cautionary tale. And in conversations about the relationship between law, society, and security, his case provides evidence that repressive laws create the vulnerabilities they claim to prevent. The dinner tables where lonely men sit in silence, the legal frameworks that criminalize private lives, the intelligence services that exploit human weakness for geopolitical advantage. These were the real battlegrounds of the Cold War. John Vassall was one casualty among thousands, a man whose personal tragedy became entangled with international conflict, and whose story reminds us that espionage is never just about secrets and documents. It's about human beings making impossible choices in situations designed to destroy them.